Whitechapel, East London. Here in 1889, a vicious killer roamed the streets. The identity of the murderer is still unknown, but he has a name: Jack the Ripper. One theory is that he was William Berry. Unlike most of the Ripper suspects, Berry was hanged for murder, the brutal killing of his wife. But was he guilty? Today we restage the trial with new witnesses and new evidence. This is the trial of William Berry, who some believe was Jack the Ripper. It's a Sunday afternoon in Dundee, Scotland. William Berry is drinking, as usual. He's 29 years old, unemployed, and recently moved from London. Today, he seems troubled. He's about to do something that will result in his own death. Around 7 p.m, William Berry walks into Dundee police station and says he has to talk to a policeman. He sits down with Lieutenant Parr and tells him an extraordinary story. He says his wife is dead and that he is afraid he might be accused of being Jack the Ripper. So what do we know about William Berry?
William Berry was born in Stourbridge, which is near Wolverhampton. He was an orphan by the time he was 6 months old. His father died when he was about 3 months old. His mother was incarcerated in Worcester City and County Lunatic Asylum. By the time he's in his late teens, he's already becoming somebody that's kind of dropped off the edge of normal society, if you see what I mean. He's not able to hold down a job, he's not seeming to form regular relationships with people, he doesn't have a proper home.
In 1887, William moves to London and settles in Bow, just to the east of Whitechapel. Here he gets a job working for a man called James Martin.
Now, James Martin was a sawdust merchant. Now, in those days, a sawdust merchant took sawdust from sawdust mills. He'd pick it up from sawdust mills or joiners' shops or whatever, carpenters' workshops, and he would sell it to likes of public houses, butcher shops, when they would scatter it on the floor. Okay, so if you just think back to the time, you walk into a public house, what's going on? It's just floorboards and sawdust, that's what you're walking on, and then they would sweep it away when it was filthy, okay? So he's selling sawdust. This is James Martin. But in reality, the sawdust business is the cover for the brothel that he's running out of Quicket Street, 80 Quicket Street. He's running a brothel. Of course, you don't want to say that, so you pose as a sawdust merchant. William Berry gets a job with him hawking sawdust. So he's picking up sawdust and taking it around pubs. Of course, the problem there is as soon as he goes into a pub with some sawdust, what's he going to do? He has a drink, he never gets out of the pub. So he was never making any money. Now, Ellen Elliot was a prostitute working for James Martin, and that's where William Berry met Ellen Elliot.
In April 1888, William and Ellen are married. But from the start, it's clear the marriage is an unhappy one.
Many testimonies will tell you how badly he treated his wife. He'd been seen sitting on top of her with a knife and all kinds of things. He seems to have been somebody that didn't work very hard. She had money that she'd been left by an aunt in the form of shares, and increasingly he was taking her money to fund his drinking sprees, although it was supposed to be to pay for horses and carts and things for his sawdust business.
A year after William Berry moves to East London, the Whitechapel killings begin. Between August and November 1888, at least 5 women are murdered, the victims of a serial killer who became known as Jack the Ripper.
The last Jack the Ripper murder occurs on the 9th of November. Now, what's interesting about this is that a change takes place in William Berry's character. So from being this violent, abusive, aggressive man, suddenly became this caring, doting husband. And he got a job in Dundee for £2 a week, and he got Ellen a job for £1 a week.
He told his wife that he had been offered employment up in Dundee for both of them in the jute trade. Where they lived, there was a jute mill quite near them, so that's how he knew about jute. it was a forged document. The letter he had didn't even have the company name spelt properly. But they came up here, she reluctantly, but he made her come up here.
On the 22nd of January 1889, William and Ellen Berry travelled by ship from London to Dundee.
They came in on the SS Cambria, the steamer. They stayed overnight, and then on the 23rd of January, they came here looking for accommodation. So here we are on Union Street, and they came to number 43. At the time, Mrs. Margaret Robertson had rooms to let, which would have suited William Berry, I'm quite sure. There was a public house. They stayed here 8 days.
But William decided the 8 shillings a week rent was too expensive. So at the end of January, they left Union Street. Their new home was considerably less comfortable.
Well, they had a property quite like this one. This is not it, because the property has been demolished. But here we have what we call a moat. Now, people think of castles and water when they think of moats, but you'll see the space between the street and the building. They had what they called the sunk flat, the basement flat, down below street level. So here's the street, you have this gap, and then there in the sunk flat, access to the property would be down these stairs. And if you can think how cold it would have been, we're in February, it's February 1889, they don't have a proper fireplace in the basement flat, it would have been very cold.
Less than 2 weeks after moving to Princes Street, William Berry presents himself at the police station and tells them his wife is dead.
He turns up at the police station on a Sunday. He speaks to the police about hoping not to be considered to be Jack the Ripper. The policeman takes what he's saying with a pinch of salt. He thinks this is a crank. He tells the police then that his wife is in the flat and that she's dead and that she'd strangled herself and that he's put her into a box. And he does mention that he mutilated the body out of a fit of temper.
And Lieutenant Parr took him upstairs to Detective David Lamb. David Lamb then told Lieutenant Parr to keep Berry in custody while he went to have a look at the property.
Apparently, Berry was not too happy when he was asked to produce the keys, but wasn't allowed to go there with the policeman. He wanted to be present, and he wasn't allowed to do that.
The police immediately go to Berry's apartment. There, they make a gruesome find. First, they enter the small kitchen, bare and apparently unused. Then they go through to the back room. Here they find a bed and a fireplace. In the fireplace they find the burned remains of women's clothing. On the floor they find some rope. And on the window ledge they find a knife with traces of blood and flesh on it. In the middle of the room is a box, and inside, the body of Ellen Berry. She has been mutilated and her leg broken in order to fit her corpse into the box. There was one other intriguing clue that they found. At the rear of the flat was another entrance with a staircase leading to it. Written on the wall was the message, "Jack Ripper is in this cellar." And on the door was written, "Jack Ripper is at the back of this door." Ewan Macpherson thinks this can only have been written by William Berry himself.
Can we consider Jack Ripper is at the back of this door, Jack Ripper is in the cellar? Can we consider these things to be a confession? Well, obviously, it's not signed, and we don't really know. But what I would ask you to think about is how many people could have produced that? The writing was older than the discovery of the tragedy. It's not me that's saying this is the Dundee Advertiser. So somebody has put this there. How many people knew there was a dead body in that property? Well, nobody, except for him. Who else could it have been? There are no candidates.
The identity of Jack the Ripper is a mystery which continues to fascinate even now. Every night of the week, dozens of people take to the streets of East London to find out more about the Whitechapel murderer.
I'd like to welcome everybody to Whitechapel. My name is Mick. I'm going to be your tour guide. What I'd like to do this evening Let's take everybody back to 1888, Victorian London, if you prefer, when things were very different around here. You see, when we think of Victorian London, what do we think of? We think top hats, everybody wore those top hats, those horse-drawn carriages passed through the cobble streets, past those gas lamps everybody likes so much. Queen Victoria was on the throne, Charles Dickens novels were doing really well, everything was fantastic. In the West End, you see, all of that was taking place in the West End of London. Here in the East End, generations of extreme poverty, extreme unemployment and extreme overcrowding had turned the whole area here into slum ghettos. This was very much the poorest part of town and not somewhere you wanted to live. It's worth remembering as well that this is a long time before the benefits system. You see, if you lost your job or you couldn't find one, which was almost certainly the case around here, you couldn't just sign on the dole, keep sticking food in your face and wait for something good to come along. There was none of that. It was up to you, one way or another, to find the money both to feed yourself and to put your head down for the night in the lodging house. There were lodging houses all around this area. These streets were full of them, and it was somewhere like that you would have been living. You didn't get a nice house, move in with a wife and kids. This was the poor part of town. Instead, you lived in a lodging house where you paid your rent on a nightly basis, and it wasn't very nice, but it did keep you off the street, you see, because the streets were dangerous and people were starving to death in the streets around here. I read one account where a woman was found starved to death right here on Wentworth Street, where we're standing now. By the time they'd found her, the rats had eaten what was left of her.
Mick Priestley is an author and true crime expert as well as a Ripper tour guide.
I think the reason people continue to be interested in it, I think it was the environment it happened in, like with the slums and the gas lamps and the top hats and this kind of thing. But I also think it's the first time you had a serial killer in a major capital city like this with a modern press following it. So it was a bigger sensation at the time than any case had been before, but it still continues to captivate people because they never caught him. If the whole case was somebody did some murders, they caught him, they hanged him, it would be a mildly interesting footnote in history, but it wouldn't have got anywhere near the publicity. And now there's so many books and movies and everything. It's one of those names that everybody's heard of.
There are 5 murders generally agreed to be the work of one man. All the killings occurred in a small area of Whitechapel.
Right, we're now standing right outside of what was number 29 Hanbury Street. It's since been demolished to make way for that lovely, tasteless extension to the Truman Brewery car park. All of the buildings on this side, though, down in the next street, and pretty much all of them we just passed on Brick Lane, are all the same ones. The event that happened here on Saturday the 8th of September 1888 would actually take place at 5:45 that morning, 5:45. The Brick Lane brewer's clock down at the bottom on the left-hand corner hit the quarter hour, and on the top floor of number 29, in the front room, with his wife and 3 fully grown sons packed in there with him, 56-year-old John Davis gets out of bed. He goes through the back door, he opens it outwards, and looking out into the yard, discovers the horribly mutilated body of Annie Chapman, lying at the bottom of a few steps there, and to the left, in between the steps and the fence. Now, speaking on day 3 of Annie Chapman's inquest, Dr. Phillips was very reluctant to reveal the full extent of what had actually happened here in the yard, stating that to make such details public would simply be disgusting. At this point, a coroner, Wynne Baxter, was overseeing proceedings. He suggested maybe all the women and children in the gallery should leave, and only when they did was Dr. Phillips persuaded to continue. It would appear she was tripped onto her back, punched in the face, and strangled violently in the early morning gloom here on Hanbury Street. We know this because her face was swollen, classic signs of strangulation. According to Dr. Phillips, her throat was then cut in 2 places with savage determination, severing her left carotid artery, spraying blood 3 feet to the left. With this done, the killer opened her legs, lifted her dress to her chest, leaving her naked from the chest down, and eviscerated her. She was cut from here all the way down to the genitals. Large chunks of flesh were cut from the stomach, removed and placed over her left shoulder. The killer put his hands inside, pulled out 3.5 feet of Annie's small intestine, and threw it into her face.
The horrific violence of the murders made the killings infamous. And the public interest only increased when a letter arrived claiming to be from the killer. It was signed Jack the Ripper. But was it really written by the murderer?
There's 2 schools of thought on that. The first school of thought is, oh yes, the killer wrote it. The second school of thought is that it was a man called Thomas Bulling who was the boss, if you like, at the newspaper agency. He's the man that said, hey, look at this letter I've been sent. And once he printed that in the newspaper the next day, he was selling triple the amount of newspapers. So some people think maybe he wrote it himself and it was a big scam to try and sell more newspapers. But regardless of who wrote it, once that letter went into the newspaper, signed Jack the Ripper, that was the one that gave him the name.
Ever since, the so-called Ripper murders have appalled and intrigued in equal measure. But the central mystery remains. Who was he?
So that brings us to the big question. The big question, of course, being who the hell was Jack the Ripper? Who was it when strolling around the East End here doing these things to people, really did get away with it, really did take the secret with him to his grave? See, it turns out just about everybody who was alive in 1888 has at some point since been accused of being Jack the Ripper, including Queen Victoria, who probably had a crown on when she went into Dorset Street, I can only assume. Lewis Carroll wrote Alice in Wonderland. He's been accused of being Jack the Ripper. The Elephant Man has been accused of being Jack the Ripper. He only lived 2 minutes down the road at the time. Fortunately, though, we do have some better suggestions.
Over the years, dozens of suspects have been proposed. So what's the evidence for William Berry? He was certainly in East London at that time, and he left for Dundee at around the time the murders stopped.
Well, Jack the Ripper never committed any more crimes in London or anywhere after the event, so that circumstantially might make you think that he was there. He lived near enough to Whitechapel that he could certainly have been the person that committed these crimes. He lived in Bow, and it's not that far from Whitechapel. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that could make you believe it could have been him. So people were putting 2 and 2 together and very much getting 4.
This was his excuse for not coming to the police on the 6th of February. He thought he might be arrested as Jack the Ripper. Now, I would have to say to you, if you're an innocent man and you woke up and your wife has killed herself, why would you think people would think you were Jack the Ripper? It doesn't make sense. You know, your wife has strangled herself to death while you're asleep. This is in Dundee, Jack the Ripper's active in London. It doesn't match, it doesn't make sense.
The fact that he brought up he alluded to the fact that they thought he might be Jack the Ripper was interesting, and it did set tongues wagging. And the newspaper reports of the time, that came out almost only 2 days after the event, they spoke about this horrible mutilation, and it reminded them of the outrages in Whitechapel. So from 2 different angles, we're getting the sense that might this be Jack the Ripper?
There is only one suspect for the crimes of Jack the Ripper who is known to have murdered a woman in the style of Jack the Ripper, and that was William Berry.
But the Dundee police were concerned with the death of Ellen Berry rather than the crimes of Whitechapel. And on the 28th of March 1889, William Berry stood trial here in Dundee Court No. 1 for the murder of his wife. With no witnesses to the death, the key evidence as to what happened in the flat was the body itself. In total, 5 pathologists examined the corpse, and their reports would be key to the trial of William Berry.
The most important expert witnesses in the courtroom that day were the medical doctors, because almost the entirety of the evidence relied on their testimony. And Templeman and Stalker, who were the doctors for the Crown, because in Scotland everything has to be corroboration, their view was that Ellen had been strangled, her body had then been cut open, perhaps while she was still alive, maybe just shortly afterwards, but certainly, possibly, a real possibility while she was still alive. Her leg broken and her body stuffed in the trunk. The defence medics, on the other hand, said, "We believe there's evidence here of suicide. We think she's self-strangulated. And yes, he's cut her open, he says he has, but it was in a moment of passion and she was dead by that point." So the 2 pieces of evidence are saying, one, murder and disembowelment whilst possibly still alive, and the other is saying suicide and a moment of passion that he just can't explain why he did that.
For 13 hours, the jury heard evidence from both sides before retiring to consider their verdict.
He's found guilty, and Lord Young therefore has no alternative but to deliver a death sentence. And so the death sentence formally goes out that William Berry will be hanged in Dundee. The previous hanging in Dundee had been 40 years before, because Dundee just didn't believe in it. So they were really worried about how the public were going to react. And so his death sentence would be carried out in private.
Here we are standing where Dundee Prison would have been, so we have the Sheriff Court, and next to the Sheriff Court was the prison. Once you were convicted in the courthouse, you never saw daylight, you were just taken down a passageway into the prison. Across the road is the old linoleum works, and from the top floor of the linoleum works you could see into the prison yard, and people gathered on the top floor of the linoleum works to watch the execution. It was not a public execution, but if you could get to the top floor of the linoleum works, you would be able to see it.
William Berry was hanged by the neck, killing him instantly. And we know that because we still have his neck bones.
So what we're holding here are the 6 vertebrae that are the neck of William Berry. When he was hanged and he was cut down from the gallows, because he was a convicted criminal, his body was taken to the anatomy department. When they got there, they would have dissected his entire body, but his area of his neck would have been of real interest to them. And as they went down through the different layers, then they would have got to this layer, which is the bone. And they retained these, so they kept his neck vertebrae. When the rest of him went off and got buried in the area outside the prison, this was kept in the anatomy department. And you can see on his second vertebrae here, which is right up at the base of his neck, you can see that there are 2 little gaps there. These are the fractures. These are the hangman's fractures. And so when the body drops and the rope tightens around the neck, this part of the bone plows forward into this space here, which is where the spinal cord sits. And it would have crushed the spinal cord. If he would have stopped breathing, his heart would have stopped beating. And so it's a good execution.
The bones give Sue an idea.
This is the 130th anniversary year of anatomy being taught at Dundee. And we thought, wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if we could celebrate it with lots of different kinds of engagement? So we started looking at what was happening in the world 130 years ago, and was there something that we could link into? And when you looked back, of course, in Whitechapel at that time, the murders were occurring in London. And we knew that up here in Dundee, we felt we had our own Jack the Ripper, our own William Berry, who some people had thought could have been responsible for those murders. And we thought, wouldn't it be a wonderful idea if we could actually reenact, reconsider the evidence, the forensic evidence, given at William Berry's trial in relation to modern day. Because at the time, the jury has a little bit of a wobble as to whether in fact he was going to be found guilty. And we want to know, will they come back with the same response now that perhaps we know a little bit more about forensic medicine than we did at the time?
And so today, February the 3rd, 2018, 129 years after Ellen's brutal murder, William Berry is once again on trial. This is the very room in which William Berry was convicted. Presiding is Lord Matthews, a judge in Scotland's Supreme Court. And, just as in the original trial, the evidence will be considered by a jury of 15 ordinary people. William Berry, though present, chose not to give evidence. Instead, his statement was read to the court.
I simply deny the charge of murder made against me. I do not want to make any statement whatever, either as to the time or manner of her death, all which is truth.
Now it's the task of the prosecution, law students from the University of Dundee, to present the evidence against Berry. The first witness is Dr. John Clark, a forensic pathologist with over 30 years' experience.
Now, how often do you conduct post-mortems, Dr. Clark?
Well, I reckon I've done over the years about 18,000 post-mortems.
The detailed autopsy accounts from 1889 have been converted into modern style reports. These now provide the key evidence for both sides.
We'll start at the head and work our way down. On the body map in front of you, can you see a line across the neck?
Yes. Yes, so that's the ligature mark, which is obviously the most important injury in this case.
And can you tell us what a ligature mark is, please?
Well, it's a mark which you get on the neck that's been compressed by some item. Okay. Pulled tight around the neck, and so this item will dig into the neck and produce a sort of pressure mark, which will often remain there afterwards.
So, can we have a closer look at the ligature mark then on the neck? Can you tell us what these images are?
It's obviously looking at the face straight on, and you can see this double-tracked line going round the neck. It's a horizontal line, so it's got an upper edge and a lower edge, and it's running horizontally round the neck, so not upwards. And that's a typical impression of a ligature mark.
Okay, and then on the evidence here, what sort of death is consistent with a horizontal, continuous ligature mark around the neck that you've just described?
Well, typically a mark like that you would get in a ligature, homicidal ligature strangulation. So strangulation in which something has been put around the neck and pulled, the ligature pulled tight by someone else. That's the most common situation you would get that. Having said that, you can get in some types of hangings, like suicidal hangings, can produce a mark very similar to that, but that's in a specific situation.
Specific situation. And is it possible for somebody to strangle themselves?
It is. It's very uncommon. I think I've only seen one case in my whole career of somebody strangling themselves.
On the evidence then that you've just described in front of you, are you able to make any conclusions about this particular ligature mark?
I mean, the findings overall, because we're not just looking at the mark, we're looking at the other evidence in this face. You know, there are what's called asphyxial signs in the face, which I haven't mentioned yet, but I've got to take that into account. I've got to take into account the fact that there is some bruising internally in the neck. And with all that, that would certainly favour to me the ligature strangulation applied by someone else.
By somebody else?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, can you tell us, in your experience, what somebody's natural reaction to being strangled is?
I have no experience because I've never been there. But I think I know what you're trying to say. What might happen?
Yes.
I would have thought it could be quite variable. It could be quite passive, and the person would just lose consciousness, sometimes very quickly, and there would be little in the way of struggle. At the other extreme, the person could be struggling, and there could be quite a violent struggle, perhaps attempting to get the ligature off the neck. And
can you identify any major injuries to the body other than the ligature mark?
There's a major wound in the middle of the lower abdomen. So this is a deep incised wound. So this is actually going right through the skin. So it's really from about the umbilicus down to the pelvis, in the midline. It's a deep wound going right into the abdominal cavity, and a bit of bowel has been protruding out of that. All the evidence with that injury and all the other sort of cutting injuries in the abdomen are that would suggest they were inflicted after death.
After death. Okay. Now, it's a matter of agreement that Lieutenant Lamb of Dundee Police found the body of Mrs. Ellen Burry in a box with these injuries. But can you tell me how common it is for victims of suicidal strangulation to end up with these sorts of injuries in a box?
Well, I've only seen one case of suicidal strangulation. You mean suicidal strangulation? I've never seen anybody hanging, strangulation, ending up inside a box with lots of wounds on their abdomen.
Given all of the evidence that we've discussed, does this look like any suicide you've ever come across?
I mean, suicides are some of the most bizarre types of death, has to be said. I don't think there's any evidence that suggests this is a straightforward suicidal hanging, you know, from a high point. I cannot completely exclude suicidal hanging from a low point suspension, and nor can I completely exclude suicidal strangulation. But then, you know, pathologists, we always say nothing is impossible, so that's why we've got to say these things. But there's an awful lot more evidence for this being a ligature strangulation caused by someone else. And I say that because additional injuries on the body, because they have asphyxial signs, the nature of the ligature mark, some bruising inside the neck. All these things sort of point to that, and not least how the body has ended up in a box.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clark.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now it's time for Dr. Clark to be questioned by the defence team, students from the University of Aberdeen.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Dr. Clark. Some hangings take place from a high point as suspension, as mentioned before by you,
Yes.
sir, where the body swings freely under the gravity of feet off the ground.
The
How-
majority of hangings are like that, yes.
However, hanging can also occur with a person kneeling, sitting, or half lying from a relatively low point of suspension, such as a doorknob or a bedpost.
Yes.
Suspension of the whole body is not necessary to cause death.
No.
Indoors, there was a large range of suspension points, doors, as well as raised objects such as a door frame.
I'm not sure there was a large range. I got the impression this was a pretty sparsely furnished place.
I
Possible.
understand, sir. Thank you for your quantification. The second report was prepared by Doctors Kinnear and Lennox, and it was dated on the 14th of February, 1889,
Yes.
3 days after the initial post-mortem exam.
Kinnear and Lennox, who appeared for the defence in the original trial, reached a very different conclusion from the prosecution experts.
Typically, if a person wishes to take their own life, there is a rising ligature mark left on the neck. From this report,
Yes.
would you be able to see that these doctors describe this mark as being that of a rising ligature mark?
Yeah, they described it as a ligature mark, same sort of ligature mark, but rising up from front to back.
Mm-hmm. But that it did rise upwards at a point.
I stress the word slightly. It's not a major.
Of course, sir.
Even with ligature strangulation caused by someone else, you could get the mark going up at a slight angle. So.
And if we continue at the page 2 of this report, their opinion was that the constriction was probably affected by strangling and that the strangulation was suicidal.
Yes, I mean, I find that remarkable that they come to such a definite opinion of suicide. This report's produced the same day as the post-mortem. They haven't had a chance to go and look at the books or things like this. So I find that quite a interesting observation.
The defence also draws attention to the fact that neither report mentions damage to the tissues of the larynx.
In a case of homicidal strangulation, there is typically more damage to this area where the ligature is applied.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, it's a major omission in both reports. Neither of them describe the larynx, which is crucial in a case like this. The implication would have to be that it was uninjured. Otherwise, I think they would have said there was an injury. Yes, it's true to say that in a ligature strangulation, it's quite common. In fact, it's probably more common than not to find bruising inside the neck and fractures. I mean, that's the expectation. It doesn't always occur, but we do have actually bruising in this case. So there is some internal damage, but there seem to be no fractures.
In a case of ligature strangulation, there is typically more damage to this area than in a suicidal hanging.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. No further questions?
Thank you.
Next, the defence team get to call their witness, Dr. Richard Shepherd, one of the UK's leading forensic pathologists.
So in this case, we have two possibilities, homicidal strangulation and hanging. Are there any differences?
Generally speaking, and we have to talk generally here, as you've already heard, there's a lot of variation in all of these possibilities. But generally speaking, a ligature strangulation, the mark is lower down the neck, and in hanging, the mark is higher up the neck.
So is it possible to hang in places other than high suspension points?
Yes, and any attachment that would allow some weight of the body to apply the pressure to the neck through the ligature. And we all know, just look at the back of our own hands, how easy it is to compress a vein on the back of a hand and stop the blood flowing through it. That's the sort of level of pressure that needs to be achieved to stop the veins in the neck, allowing blood to drain away as well. So we're not searching for huge pressures in order to constrict the neck to a point where death may ensue.
In the report from Dr. Kinnear and Lennox, they describe the marking as follows. Encircling the neck is a band of blue discoloured skin, the upper being more marked than the lower. Viewed from either side, the band has therefore a slightly oblique direction from below and upwards, and from before backwards.
In distinction, perhaps from Templeman and Stalker, that Kinnear and Lennox felt this line sloped from the front to the back of the neck.
So what caused these marks?
They're clearly ligature marks passing around the neck.
What can be used as a ligature?
Well, anything can be used for the ligature. It may be a torn piece of sheeting, it may be an item of clothing, but more commonly it's something like a piece of rope, a piece of cord, a piece of flex, something that will bend around the neck, obviously, in order to cause compression encircling the neck.
So what does the presence of a rising ligature mark indicate as seen on production 5?
A rising ligature mark has a significance in forensic pathology because it suggests that there is a point of attachment. It suggests that the point that's highest is being held up whilst the body is sagging down. And that's the significance of a sloping ligature mark as opposed to a horizontal ligature mark.
So from the material that you have had, is it possible for you to be definitive about whether this was a rising ligature mark or not?
No, we have two reports that have essentially equal weight because we have no photographs, we have no method of checking or cross-checking any of the information contained within them. But we have two groups of two pathologists who have described things slightly differently and taking slightly different views upon them.
Turning now to the issue of the larynx, did you consider both the post-mortem reports in relation to the injuries recorded as found on Mrs. Burry's neck?
There were no comments in either report, as we've heard, about the larynx, and the presumption here is that there were no injuries present. It would appear in 1888 or thereabouts, positive findings were recorded. In other words, if there was an injury, it would be noted, but the absence of injury wouldn't be specifically excluded.
So there's no damage recorded to the larynx?
There is no damage recorded to the larynx, and I would agree with Dr. Clark. On that basis, we assume that no damage was present.
Is this more consistent with hanging?
Once again, it's shades, and it has to be shades in this area of forensic pathology. It would point towards the use of less force, and it would point towards hanging as opposed to ligature strangulation, if those are the two ends of the spectrum that we are looking at.
The jury have heard two rather different accounts from the pathologists. In 1889, this led to the jury giving an unusual verdict.
What they said was, we think he's guilty, but we're asking you for mercy. And the reason that they'd hesitated and asked for mercy in the first instance was because they said they felt there was a conflict within the medical evidence. So there was, in fact, in their mind, for some of them anyway, some doubt. And Lord Young quite rightly said, you can't do that. You come back and you either tell me that he's guilty, he's not guilty, or the third verdict that we have in Scotland, which is not proven. You can't give me a verdict and ask me to qualify it. So go back into the jury room and come back with one of those three verdicts. And they came back 5 minutes later. And 5 minutes later, they said, he's guilty.
Now, the prosecution are hoping to convince today's jury to reach the same verdict. So they're going to question Dr. Shepherd's evidence.
Can we focus on the examinations by Drs. Kinnear and Lennox?
Yes, of course.
How many days had passed before Drs. Kinnear and Lennox were able to access the body of Mrs. Burry for her post-mortem?
The original post-mortem was on the 11th of February. and Doctors Kinnear and Lennox were on the 14th of February. My memory is, or I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm incorrect, that she was found dead on Monday the 11th.
So potentially the body could have been dead for almost around 9-10 days?
Yes, well, clearly the body's been dead for three more days, so we shift that along. It's between 6 and 9 days when Doctors Kinnear and Lennox are performing their examination.
What levels of deterioration would you tend to find in a body that had been left for that period of time?
It's very difficult to be certain. Neither of the sets of pathologists gives us a clue what they use to make these assessments. Doctors Kinnear and Lennox don't say the body was so badly decomposed that they were unable to see marks. They comment on the marks that they saw and seem to have had no difficulty in seeing them. It has to be, any comment I make has to be essentially be an educated guess. February in Dundee isn't warm, once again I would guess, and therefore 3 days or 6 days in the house is not, in a cold flat, is not going to cause the degree of deterioration of the body that one might see nowadays in a centrally heated house. Likewise, if the body is placed into a refrigerator after the first examination, deterioration will occur, but probably not hugely in that situation.
Would it be fair in saying that Doctors Templeman and Stalker were at a significant advantage over Kinnear and Lennox, having had essentially a first glance and fresher eyes?
Yes, it's always a difficult question, and it's always a difficult thing to cope with as the pathologist coming to do the second examination. Things have changed, but experience will tell you how they are likely to have changed. So yes, there would have been changes, but I do this on a regular basis, not day after day, but certainly month after month, and I'm aware of the changes that occur, as would, I'm sure, Dr. Kinnear and possibly Dr. Lennox.
Thank you. And the ligature line is particularly important to determine the nature of Mrs. Bury's death in this case.
The ligature line is crucially important, certainly, yes, and also the internal examination.
Of course. And other circumstantial factors of evidence, of course, are important to this case.
Well, the pathologists worry about pathology, and I leave the court to worry about the other findings in their considerations.
Dr. Shepherd, how many cases of suicide have you saw in where the deceased has been found with their intestines hanging outside of their body as a result of their partner finding them deceased?
Well, it would be a very rare case. Certainly cases of post-mortem mutilation are significantly common. But I would have to accept that suicide and then mutilation is an extremely rare event.
One would hope. And how common is it of people to hide the bodies of suicide victims that they come across?
That's not uncommon. There are all sorts of reasons that they could do that. It doesn't happen every day, but it's not uncommon.
But it would be safe to say that it's more common that people tend to hide the bodies of people that they have killed?
Yes, I think that would be a fair assessment.
Upon considering the actions of Mr. Bury and including his mutilation of the corpse, would the circumstances in this case be wholly unfamiliar to a homicide?
Could I exclude a homicide on all these features? I don't think it's possible, given the shades of the spectrum that I've described, to say this could not be a homicide. What I'd say is there are significant features within it that cause me great concern to call it a homicide. The lack of injuries that I've already described, they are very worrying features to me in saying I think this has been definitely inflicted by a third party.
Okay, thank you.
Finally, the prosecution, then the defence, present their closing arguments to the jury.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is my role to sum up the case for the prosecution. This is the tragic story for the relationship where the husband was an abusive drunk, repeatedly beat his wife, and was only with her because of her money. She was dragged to Dundee from London on a lie, And just 2 weeks later, this poor, innocent woman who'd been left penniless by her husband was murdered. I'm sure the counsel for the defence are going to try and convince you this was suicide. This is not the case. The accused states that he found his wife's body slumped on the floor. Surely if she had hanged herself, she would still have been suspended from wherever she hung herself from, not slumped on the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to put yourself in the accused's shoes for a moment. You wake up in the morning, you find your loved one has hanged themselves. What's your first reaction? Grief? To try and save them? To get help? Surely it's not to brutally disfigure the body and try to dispose of it. Who other than a murderer would do this? There is no dispute over the cause of death being strangulation. However, if this were suicide by hanging, more often than not, there would have been a much more significantly upward slope in the ligature of the neck, as we have heard also. To sum up, ladies and gentlemen, there is but one explanation for the death of Mrs. Ellen Bury. Her husband, the accused, Mr. William Bury, murdered her. He carefully prepared for and planned her murder, then carried out this horrific plan. He strangled her, stabbed her, and disfigured the corpse of his wife, shoved her carelessly into a custom-made coffin by folding her leg across her body and left her there. I ask you to consider all of the evidence you've heard and you've seen, and in doing so, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to find in favour of the University of Dundee today. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is now my duty to speak to you on behalf of the Aberdeen student team, who here represent the defence, and in doing so I shall seek to persuade you in our favour. To find in our favour and to hold that the Dundee team, who here represent the Crown, have not proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. They of course contend that the cause of death was homicidal strangulation, that what took the life of Ellen Bury was a murderous act, as opposed to a tragic, self-inflicted hanging. Our case is that when the forensic science, is a science, here is carefully considered and properly analysed, you will find that the post-mortem findings are consistent with Ellen Bury losing her life because of self-inflicted hanging, and that the homicide has not been established beyond a reasonable doubt. To do justice to such a sad case, and doing so in the right way, means separating our hearts from our heads and yet admitting it will be affected all the same. To illustrate the strength of our case, we can look together at the medical evidence one by one. First, the lack of the damage to the larynx and neck. If this wasn't a violent attack of a man who was trying to kill his wife, would there not be more evidence of this? The lack of injury to the deeper muscles of the neck and the larynx is more in keeping with hanging than in homicidal strangulation. Can I move on to my second point, the ligature mark and the suspension point? Through extensive examination, the ligature mark has become a source of controversy on both sides. In Templeman and Stalker's post-mortem, and to which Dr. Clark agrees with on this matter, the horizontal mark found in the neck is indicative of homicidal strangulation. On the other hand, Kinnear and Lennox's post-mortem document expresses a rising ligature mark, which is more indicative of hanging. Can I now say something of the facts? Looking at both together demonstrates the power of our case. William Bury brought the circumstances of his wife's death to the police. He went to the authorities and to Lieutenant James Parr, reported that he had found his wife on the floor and she was dead, that she'd hung herself with a rope. If genuinely he'd wanted to ship her off in a box, and his actions are completely at odds with that at all. You will see that there is reasonable doubt, and if there is reasonable doubt in this case, then this should compel you to dismiss and to follow with the Aberdeen case. So, the Aberdeen team submit, this was a hanging.
Now, it's over to the jury.
So, ladies and gentlemen, the other thing I usually tell juries is that there is no pressure of time on them whatsoever. They can have as much time as they want, or as little time as they want. In this case, you've got 15 minutes. So can I ask you please to retire and consider your decision? Thank you.
In the original trial, the jury reached a verdict in just 25 minutes. This jury have to be even quicker.
So if we think that Dundee proved the case that he was guilty, could you put your hand up, please? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. For Aberdeen, for the defence, if you feel that they presented their case. So 1, 2, 6, 7. So we'll need to have a discussion, and then we have about 10 minutes at the most before we vote again.
I wasn't sure about as to whether it was a strangulation or a hanging, and I don't think either side to me felt like they were actually. I just couldn't decide which way it was.
Both of the guys who gave evidence more or less indicated that there was more evidence in their minds in different areas to suggest that the lady had been hung.
Could he have strangled her with her being asleep so that there was no force? He slept beside her.
No evidence to suggest that.
But then she was straddled, and there was no evidence of a struggle.
Not necessarily. Well, I just wondered because it can be very, very fast.
If he was to quickly wrap, or the force that he would exert would be enough to cause damage to the larynx or the hyoid.
Yeah, the first guy, the first expert witness, more or less said it could be really quick.
Yeah. When he went to the police, he said he found his wife on the floor with a rope round her neck. Now, if you found your wife or your partner hanging from a door handle, you would surely say I found her hanging from a door handle, not lying on the floor.
That's a state of mind at the time.
Okay, we were asked by the judge to vote on whether Dundee had proved the case that he was guilty of murder. So, if you believe Dundee had proved the case that he was guilty, put your hand up. Okay, I think so too. Okay, so that's 2. So, who thinks Aberdeen proved the case that he on their evidence that there's reasonable doubt? Yeah, okay, so there should be 13. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 11, 12. Was there reasonable doubt?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. So Aberdeen proved the case.
I personally think he's guilty, but I couldn't commit to
Yeah,
is that what we're all thinking?
Okay, so we're saying.
Kelly, make sure you say the right one.
Find for the prosecution or the defence?
We find for the defence by majority. 13 for the defence.
Thank you.
Well, William Berry, stand up for a moment, please. I've got some good news and some bad news for you. The good news is that you've been acquitted of the murder of your wife. The bad news is that I'm quite convinced you're Jack the Ripper, and to be on the safe side, I'm going to sentence you to death anyway.
The verdict was incredible because we couldn't lose either way, regardless of how the verdict came out. 130 years ago, they found him guilty, and if today they found him guilty, then that would support what happened then. But bearing in mind at that time, they came back with guilty, but they asked for mercy, suggested that they had some doubt. And this jury today clearly had doubt as well. So that nobody's found him innocent. He could still well have been guilty, but there was sufficient doubt that needed more investigation. And if you're going to condemn a man to death, you have to be certain. And nobody then or now is actually certain of William Berry's guilt.
So, where does that leave the theory that William Berry was Jack the Ripper?
We have a modus operandi that matches. We have a person who was in the right location at the right time. So I think, when you look at the Berry case compared with the other cases, I think it's a very, very strong case.
Was he Jack the Ripper? I don't know on that one either, I have to say, but it's a rather compelling theory and it makes a great story.